They say empires do not fall overnight, but what if they begin dying long before their first crack appears like a star, burning brilliantly while already collapsing within? There is a mosque in the heart of Istanbul, silent, vast, and forgotten. Not the famous Blue Mosque or Hagia Sophia, but a smaller one, tucked behind narrow alleys where tourists rarely wander. Its marble columns lean never so slightly, as if exhausted by the centuries. On its inner dome, a barely visible inscription in faded Arabic reads, "Empires wrought not from war, but from forgetfulness." The Ottoman Empire did not merely fall, it decayed from within, its unraveling slow, hidden, almost imperceptible, until the world realized it was gone. But let us not begin at the end. To understand the fall, we must first trace the shadowed thread that runs through its heart century by century, secret by secret. It begins not in 1923, when the empire was officially dissolved, nor in 1918, when the Sultanate lost the Great War. It begins with a boy. Born in a tent, beneath a sky of endless stars, Osman, the son of Ertugrul. A child of horsemen, shaped by wind, prayer, and sword. When he dreamed, it is said, he saw a tree growing from his chest, its branches stretching across the countenance, the roots deep in the Quran, the leaves sheltering many peoples. This dream, recorded in whispers, was believed to be divine, and so the Ottomans called themselves Devlet Ibad Mudit, the eternal state. But eternity is fragile. The Ottomans began not as conquerors, but as survivors, raiders on the edge of a crumbling Seljuk world. Their strength was not only in the sword, but in adaptability, a genius for absorbing cultures, systems, even religions. Byzantines became viziers, Greeks became architects, Armenians, treasurers. Jews fleeing Europe found refuge in Ottoman lands, bringing with them knowledge of trade, printing, medicine. This was not tolerance born of morality, it was born of empirecraft. And yet, within this mosaic of power, a dangerous seed had been planted, dependence on diversity without integration. Power centralized in the Sultan, yes, but also fractured across ethnic lines, religious classes, secret orders, and provincial warlords. From its earliest days, the Ottoman Empire was a grand spinning machine held together not by unity, but by balance, a single cog removed. And the whole begins to tremble. By the 16th century, that tremble had begun, but it was not felt in the palaces, it was heard in the silence of libraries. One by one, Ottoman scholars abandoned science for theology. Telescopes were traded for Quranic commentary. The empire, once a beacon of knowledge, shuttered its eyes to the changing world. When Copernicus reshaped the heavens, the Ottomans did not listen. When Newton split light, the Ottomans looked away. They believed God had given them enough. And yet outside, the world roared louder. The printing press arrived in Europe in the mid-1400s. Ideas spread like wildfire in the Ottoman world. The press was banned, not fully, not officially, but practically. Religious scholars feared corruption. Scribes feared unemployment. The result? A literate elite in the West and an empire that, century by century, began to forget itself. But forgetting is not always passive. Sometimes it is deliberate. Hidden in the imperial archives are records of entire regions erased from maps. Villages whose names were changed, histories revised. To preserve unity, the Ottomans often rewrote the past. When rebellions broke out, when minorities demanded rights, their stories were cleansed from the record, scrubbed with the ink of obedience. This was not a flaw unique to the Ottomans. Every empire censors, every power rewrites. But the Ottomans did it so thoroughly, so quietly, that even their own descendants would forget who they once were. And what of the Janissaries, the elite guard, the backbone of Ottoman might? They too began as a strange paradox. Christian boys taken from the Balkans, converted, trained, and sworn to the Sultan alone. They were loyal beyond loyalty until they were not. Over centuries, the Janissaries became corrupt, political, entitled. They installed sultans and assassinated rivals. By the 19th century, they were not soldiers, but parasites holding the empire hostage. And when Sultan Mahmud II finally destroyed them in 1826, it was not a triumph. It was a funeral, not just for the Janissaries, but for an age. In every corner of the empire, signs appeared subtle, symbolic, suppressed, a calligraphy. Artist in Bursa painted a tulip with broken petals. A poet in Damascus compared the Sultan's silence to the silence of God. A merchant in Salonika whispered that the empire was becoming a beautiful ghost and still. It marched on as if the machine had learned to run without its soul. But perhaps the most haunting sign of all was the one no one noticed because it wasn't recorded in books or songs or scrolls. It was in the eyes of the people. The weariness, the quiet, the feeling that something sacred was slipping away and no one dared name it. This wasn't collapse, not yet. This was breathlessness, a 600-year inhale, held too long. And now, as the world began to spin faster with steam, science, revolution, the Ottomans stood still, and the silence grew louder. We've only just begun. A world was ending, but not with a bang, nor even a whisper. It was ending with paperwork. In the late 19th century, deep inside the Ottoman bureaucracy, clerks recorded the crumbling of an empire with obsessive precision. Every province, every deficit, every revolt documented, stamped, filed, a state still trying to measure itself, while the ground beneath it shifted. But numbers cannot account for what was really breaking. Across the vast imperial expanse from the hills of Albania to the sands of Arabia, the Ottoman center was losing its pull, not because of invasion, not yet, but because belief was thinning. The sacred bond between ruler and ruled had become brittle, hollowed by distance, corruption, and time. In Syria, local leaders spoke of Istanbul as if it were a foreign land. In Egypt, Mehmed Ali Pasha had already built his own dynasty under the Sultan's nominal authority. And in the Balkans, a storm was brewing, whispers of nationalism, of liberation, of blood. But the Ottomans did not fear ideas, they feared fire, and the fire came. In 1876, a young sultan named Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne. At first, he promised reform, new schools, a constitution, even a parliament. For a brief moment, it felt like the empire might breathe again, but the breath was shallow, and the hope was short-lived. Within 2 years, the parliament was dissolved, the constitution shelved. Abdul Hamid ruled alone from behind gilded curtains, through spies and shadows. They called him the Red Sultan, to some a tyrant, to others the last bulwark against the West, because the West was no longer knocking, it was carving. British engineers surveyed Ottoman railroads as if planning their own. French archaeologists plundered ruins with imperial impunity. German officers trained Ottoman troops in modern warfare, teaching them how to die more efficiently. The empire, once feared, had become a project, one to be studied, managed, influenced. Even the holy cities were not immune. In Mecca and Medina, the spiritual heart of Islam, pilgrims arrived under Ottoman banners, but the Wahhabi movement, rising in Arabia, saw those banners as hypocrisy. The caliphate, they claimed, had become impure, more concerned with taxes than truth. And from this ideological fracture, the seeds of future kingdoms were planted. But perhaps the most unsettling rupture came not from rebellion, but from reform itself. The Tanzimat, a series of modernization efforts begun in the mid-1800s, aimed to save the empire by reshaping it. New laws modeled after France. Secular courts, uniform taxation, military conscription. On paper, it was progress. In practice, it alienated everyone. Conservatives saw it as betrayal. Religious leaders feared the erosion of Islam. Minorities, though promised equality, often found themselves caught between old prejudice and new bureaucracy. The empire was trying to become something it was not, a European nation-state, without realizing that its strength had always been in being something else entirely. And then came 1908. A group of reformist officers known as the Young Turks staged a coup. They restored the constitution, reopened parliament, promised freedom, equality, and unity. For a moment, again, the empire shimmered with the illusion of revival. But illusions are delicate. What began as unity quickly fractured into purges, assassinations, and ideological cleansing. The Young Turks, in their quest to modernize, became obsessed with control. They narrowed identity. They defined who was truly Ottoman and who was not. It was under their rule that the most tragic chapter unfolded. In 1915, as the empire fought for its life in World War I, hundreds of thousands of Armenians accused of treachery were forced from their homes, marched through deserts, starved, executed, a wound still open, still denied by some, still grieved by many. The Ottomans did not collapse with glory. They unraveled through contradiction. An Islamic empire led by secular reformers, a multicultural realm enforcing uniform identity, a spiritual caliphate siding with foreign powers in a war it barely understood. By 1918, the war was lost. Istanbul was occupied. The Sultan, once God's shadow on earth, was a puppet under Allied watch. And yet, even now, the empire had not quite died. In Anatolia, something stirred. A general, silent, sharp-eyed, and cold, began organizing resistance. Mustafa Kemal, later he would be called. He was no Ottoman, not in heart, not in name. He called the empire a corpse and vowed to bury it. But before he did, he studied it. He walked its ruins, read its treaties, watched how power was gained, lost, hidden. And with that knowledge, he built something new, not an empire, but a republic, a secular nation on the bones of 6 centuries. In 1924, the caliphate was abolished, the eternal state declared mortal. The last Ottoman sultan fled by boat, exiled, forgotten. The empire was gone, or so it seemed. But echoes do not die so easily. The laws, the buildings, the rhythms of prayer still linger in the corners of former provinces. Old men in Sarajevo still recall Ottoman lullabies. A doorframe in Jerusalem bears the tugra of a sultan long dead. And in the shadows of modern Turkey, debates rage. Not about the empire's fall, but about whether it ever truly ended. Because history is not a graveyard. It is a mirror, cracked and shifting, and in that mirror, sometimes we see the past blinking back, but the mystery is not over. The fall may be told, but the breath still echoes. Are you ready for the final revelation? In the archives of Topkapı Palace, beneath dust and silence, there lies a peculiar map. It shows no borders, no cities, only rivers and stars flowing across parchment as if the land itself were breathing. At the bottom, written in calligraphy too delicate to be hurried, a single line: what falls in time may rise again beyond it. Was it a prophecy? A warning? Or just the poetic whim of an old cartographer, tracing the end of the world he knew? Empires fall, that much is certain, but the Ottoman Empire was never simply a state. It was a worldview, a rhythm, a way of binding heaven and earth in the same sentence. And perhaps that's why its fall still lingers not only in textbooks or ruins, but in the very tension of the modern world, because the empire may have died. But its questions remain. What is power without unity? What is unity without memory? In the final years of the Ottoman twilight, as modernity surged like a flood, those who clung to the old ways often did so with trembling hands. In Damascus, calligraphers still inked Quranic verses onto scrolls by candlelight. In Baghdad, musicians played Daoud melodies unchanged for centuries. In Istanbul, some prayed not for salvation but for stillness, for one more breath of the world they remembered. And all the while, new ideologies marched in wearing suits, carrying rifles, building borders. The Treaty of... In 1920, a dagger disguised as diplomacy carved up the empire like a carcass. France took Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. Greece eyed Anatolia. Armenia declared independence. Kurds were promised and denied a homeland. The Ottomans, once masters of complexity, were now reduced 2 lines on colonial maps. But this wasn't just geopolitics, it was metaphysics. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman world had functioned not through rigidity, but through negotiated contradiction. The Sultan was both warrior and scholar. The empire was both Islamic and pluralistic. Cities were both Ottoman and uniquely themselves. It was not a structure, it was a song, improvised, layered, alive. But the 20th century demanded answers, clear lines, flags, nations. Identity as declaration, not dialogue, and so the empire's fluid soul was pressed into static form in the rush to modernize. Republic cut the umbilical cord, replacing Arabic script with Latin, banning the fez, silencing the call to prayer in Turkish for a time. In doing so, he did not just reform the state, he severed its memory. An empire is not only land, it is language, posture, silence. When those are stripped, something unspeakable is lost. Still, not all ghosts remain quiet. In Bosnia, in Kosovo, in parts of Macedonia, old women still fold grape leaves with Ottoman rhythm, still whisper Turkish lullabies to babies who speak Slavic tongues. In Cairo, the echoes of Ottoman court customs appear in weddings, in greetings, in gestures. In Jerusalem, ancient Ottoman laws still govern land disputes, baffling modern courts, and in Turkey, debates rage not only about policy but about identity. Is the empire a wound? A glory? A warning? A mirror? Because for many, the empire's collapse was not just political, it was personal. It was the loss of something larger than oneself, a loss that still aches, unspoken, beneath the noise of nationalism and the grind of globalism. And perhaps that is why the Ottoman story still haunts us, not because of what it did, but because of what it tried to be: a bridge, a balance, a dream too vast to survive the modern world. Or perhaps it wasn't the world that killed it. Perhaps it was something older, entropy, the law that all things, no matter how grand, fade. Even stars die, even mountains erode, even empires, born from dreams and fire, eventually forget how to breathe. But if we listen closely, we may hear what remains: the rustle of silk robes in museum glass, the echo of adhans in foreign accents, the crackle of a letter written in Ottoman Turkish, unreadable now by most of its own descendants, and the question that refuses to be silenced: can something so vast truly die? Or does it merely change form? A soul scattered into 1,000 fragments, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be named, waiting perhaps to rise again, not as an empire of borders and banners, but as a whisper, a rhythm, a breath. They say time moves forward, but in Istanbul it curls, wander the crooked alleys behind. Mosque, and you may find a wall cracked, ivy-wrapped, forgotten. On it, etched by a hand long turned to dust, are these words: the wind does not mourn the tree that falls, it carries its seeds. The Ottoman Empire has fallen, that much no longer stirs debate. But in its fall, something scattered, something older than flags, older than titles, older even than the name Ottoman, an inheritance of rhythm and contradiction, of stillness in chaos, of plurality in devotion. Even now, the breath of the empire lingers, though no longer called by that name. You can feel it in Sarajevo, where the call to prayer meets the toll of church bells. In Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, where trades spoken in Persian, Greek, Arabic, and Ladino still echo beneath the vaulted stone. In forgotten cemeteries along the Danube, where Ottoman tombstones lean like tired guardians, their inscriptions kissed by moss and memory. And perhaps most curiously, in the Turkish Republic itself, modern, secular, fiercely independent. And yet, the architecture still arches with Ottoman elegance. The food still blends Balkan, Arab, and Anatolian soul. The very language, though Latinized, still bears the cadence of empire. Even politics, polarized, symbolic, cyclical, mirrors the endless negotiation that once defined the court of the Sultan. It is as if the empire were not erased, but folded into the DNA of nations. Folded into stories, recipes, gestures, silences. It lives not as a government, but as a question we return to whenever borders are drawn too sharply, whenever identity is used to divide rather than bind, whenever modernity races ahead and forgets to bring the soul with it. The Ottomans were not perfect. Their legacy is not a fairy tale. Beneath the grandeur lie wars, betrayals, massacres, blind spots, and broken oaths. Any empire, when stretched across centuries, leaves behind both marvel and misery. But their story offers us something rare in today's world, a model of complexity held in balance. They ruled a realm where Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Kurds, and Turks shared not sameness but space, where Sufis danced in the same cities, where bureaucrats stamped decrees, where palaces rose beside madrasas, beside churches, beside bazaars. And in this strange harmony, chaotic, fragile, often unjust, there was still a rhythm. A rhythm that said, you do not have to erase the other to survive. That lesson now drifts like incense across a world increasingly fractured. In our quest for modernity, have we lost something ancient? In our demand for purity, have we forgotten the strength of paradox? In our obsession with progress, have we severed ourselves from the roots that held us? The Ottomans did not fear the contradictions. They wore them like a cloak. They ruled from both mosque and throne. They prayed to the divine and played the politics of mortals. They carried Qurans into battle and built fountains for stray cats. This too was empire, not glory, not horror, but humanity written large. And now, as we walk among the ruins, it is not empire we should resurrect, but memory. Memory not as nostalgia, but as instruction. A map drawn in stars, not borders. A call to listen before drawing lines, to honor before condemning, to breathe before building. Perhaps this is why the empire still haunts us, not because we want it back, but because we want back what it held. A sense that the human world, in all its contradiction and color, might still be held in a single breath, not by force, but by rhythm. And so we end where we began, in silence, not the silence of endings, but the silence before something begins again. Beneath the rubble of fallen domes, between the pages of censored books, in the breath between old words whispered by young voices, the soul of the empire stirs, waiting, watching, echoing. Empires rot, not from war, but from forgetfulness. But those we remember, they never truly die.